Hello and welcome. I'm Uday Pratap Singh. You're joining us on a brand new episode of the NewsX and Business World panels on the Indian economy, the fiscal stimulus package that the government has announced, and of course now the road ahead for corporate India. On the show today, a power-packed panel to help us decode things. Let's welcome all of them first onto the discussion. Mr. Ashish Bhasin live with us, CEO APAC and Chairman India for Densu Aegis Network. Welcome, sir. Mr. Alok Jalan also joining us, Managing Director of the Lakshya Media Network and Group. Mr. Tariq Abu Bakr, Managing Director, ME Corp Trustees India is also live with us. Mr. Puneet Pandey, Promoter Financial Services, PRP Professional Edge is joining us live. Dhruv Agarwal, Group CEO, Housing.com, Makan.com and PropTiger.com is also live with us. Tamanna Dhamija, ConvoSide co-founder, is also with us live. Vivek Soin, Founding Director and Chief Operating Officer of Westcourt, which is an international real estate development, is also joining us. And Dr. Anurag Batra, Chairman and Editor-in-Chief Businessworld and Exchange for Media Group, completes our panel this evening. Welcome all of you. Firstly, thank you for being with us. Let me begin with you first, Mr. Bhasin, if I can. Your initial takeaways of what the government has announced so far. Now, absolutely unprecedented times for the Indian economy. The government coming out with a financial stimulus. What did you really believe was your main takeaway from that stimulus? What was your big thumbs up? And what do you believe still needs to be done now to further the Indian growth story out of this pandemic?
Well, first of all, as like you said, the scale of this was completely unprecedented. And you have to remember that the resources available with the government are finite. They are not as much as we think that they are, particularly at a time like this when revenues are tight. Given that, I think the government has actually done a pretty good job going quite systematically. The first thing was safety and security. They had to make sure that people had food to eat and basic necessities were provided. So to the poor people, because there was a total loss of livelihood, I think the whole effort was how do you get food grains out, how do you get all of that going, which was well handled. After that, once it was realized that the lockdown is going to be extended, it was also realized, I think, that the impact of the economy is probably going to be much more than what we had initially anticipated. I think, and also at that time, the smaller businesses were suffering a lot, which is when all the efforts to get MSMEs some relief, get bank loans, etc., going was there. So I think they went about it systematically. They did it well. Is it enough? Of course, it's not enough. And there is a lot more that they needed to have done and could have done. But then it's never enough. And you will never have the resources to do it. The critical thing is that, between announcing a policy and its actual implementation on ground, there is often a very, very big difference. And I think that needs to be bridged. At the moment, that gap still remains to be there. So the intent, the announcement of the intent is good. But are you really getting the loans as easily as you want? Is it helping to move the economy? The biggest problem that we are going to face to restart the economy actually are going to be two. One is going to be liquidity, right? Everywhere liquidity is going to be under short supply because revenues have been frozen for the last 60, 90 days for most industries, barring a few. And the second whole area is going to be of regeneration of demand. So initially, when the opening up happens, we are seeing some demand. It's probably a bit of a pent-up demand. You're also seeing like in China, revenge buying. One single showroom of Hermes did $2.7 million of business in Guangzhou and so on and so forth. So there's a pent-up demand, right? Yeah. But that will last for 15 days, 1 month. Now, after that, what? So I think the whole focus now has to shift. We've looked after the basic necessities of the people as well as we could. We've supported the small businesses as well as the government's resources allowed it to. It's got to now make sure that A, those are implemented properly, and B, more importantly, bigger corporates, specific sectors that have been impacted very significantly, like travel, like hospitality, like airlines, those are addressed. Otherwise, they'll start going under. And most importantly, take all efforts to regenerate demand, because that's going to be the biggest impediment to growth. I have, for example, written to the INB minister in my capacity as the president of the Advertising Agencies Association of India. And amongst other things, one of the things we had suggested to him was incentivize advertising. Maybe if, for example, if I spend 100 rupees on advertising, I get a tax break worth 200 rupees as an example. That will incentivize me as a manufacturer to advertise. The moment I advertise, there will be demand. The moment there's demand, the liquidity cycle starts flowing. There were other ideas as well. You could allow advertising expenses to be amortized over a period of time. Now, whether you take advertising as the route or whatever you take, the whole focus now has to shift. How do we get demand going? Because if you don't have demand going, production is not going to be able to come back to normalcy, because why will somebody produce? If my dealers are not selling cars, why will I manufacture cars? And the next phase now, the government has to come up with stimuli, come up with plans and policies that generate demand and generate it quickly, because the economy can no longer afford to remain in a pause mode at all.
Okay.
Mr. Bhasin, you made the point in your letter and now also that advertising creates demand, and hence there should be an incentive for manufacturers, for business owners to advertise. If you had to say, what kind of impact the advertising business has seen in the 60 days. So if the brands were at 100 as an activity, are there at 20, 30, 10, where they are? Second, US Dentsu Aegis Network over the last 8 years have done multiple acquisitions, 13 or 14 if I can count. Over the next 10 months, will we see Dentsu Aegis Network to do more acquisitions? Because the valuations of some of your acquiring companies will be more lucrative. So on these two, I would want more comments from you.
Well, your first question as to how will demand help, right? That's your question. How will demand?
And where is the advertising activity? If 100 rupees were being spent in March, where are we on 30th May?
The industry has been significantly impacted. There are some parts which have been impacted where 100 rupees has gone down to zero. For example, in the events business or out-of-home business. I mean, there's no question of an event happening, right? So it's gone down to near zero. Even out of home, people are locked in, so they're not out of home. So how will you have, out of home going on and so on? So there's some parts that are impacted very heavily. There are others like digital, which are relatively less impacted, but I think everything is impacted. Yeah. Other than a few categories, FMCGs, players like Hindustan Lever, Reckitt's, Amul, which have daily necessity, essential goods, which in any case, whether it's a lockdown or not, are being distributed, were being consumed. Other than those categories, I think most other categories almost brought their advertising to zero, as indeed probably they should, because the whole idea of advertising is to generate demand, to get people, to get footfalls to come to shops, right? Now, if the shops are going to be closed, why would I spend my money advertising? The second impact, so I would say overall, the industry has come down to about 50 to 60% down from where it was. So if I look at April 2020 versus April 2019, the final figures haven't come in, but my guess is going to be that it will be anywhere between 50 to 60% down.
Okay.
And that is huge, as you can imagine. Okay. Now, specifically to answer your second
acquisitions.
On acquisitions. Well, acquisitions is an integral part of our strategy. And I have always said that I would like 50% of my growth to be organic and 50% of it to be inorganic. And the simple reason for that is that not only does it bring you new techniques, new areas, new expertise in areas that you may not have within your company, but it also brings in fresh blood. Ours is talent-based business. And if people are good enough to have built very successful businesses of their own, I would rather have them in my group than outside, right? So therefore, it's an integral part of my strategy. At the moment, we've put all acquisitions on a pause because I think for every businessman, just now, the key has to be to conserve cash. Like I said earlier, liquidity is going to be...
So acquisitions have been affected and so have advertising. There needs to be incentives. Okay, I'll just come back to you. Mr. Bhasin, in just a second.
Put on a pause. So we will...
Okay. I'll just come back to you. Let me bring in Mr. Jalan for his opening comments as well. Alok Jalan, come in here. On your initial takeaways, of course, of what the government has done so far. And you can also perhaps weigh in on the advertising point that Mr. Bhasin was making, since you're also in a similar space. Go ahead.
So I see ultimately advertising is overall a subset of overall economy and industry. So until unless we give a kickstart to overall economy, I don't think advertising industry in itself is going to do very well. What I feel is that on liquidity side, on supply side, government has done some bit of infusion in terms of loans to MSMEs and things like that. But I think on demand side, I agree with Mr. Bhasin that on demand side, we have not seen anything which is substantial. And in my opinion, demand is going to take a little bit of time. So while there might be pent-up demand and it may take maybe a couple of weeks, but when we, so if I look at one measure of stock market, it talks about greed and fear. I think right now we are in extreme fear kind of scenario globally and in India also. It is there is a fear of health and there is a fear of job loss and those kind of financials. So I don't think we have ever seen this kind of scenario. We have all seen 2009, but this is, if I may say so, this seems to be a 10x bigger problem than that. And India being a small or poor country, not very surplus with funds. Sorry. Developing, and if we look at per capita income, it is kind of a poor country. So here we don't have too much resources. Actually, government also does not have too many resources to do too many things. But I think a lot of things can be done without kind of pumping in too much money also. So like the measures which RBI has done, I think they are all good measures, and they will de-stress people to some bit, all the deferment of EMIs and those kind of things. So I think that will keep people little better off than if they were to pay their EMIs and all those kind of things. So I think going forward, what government can do, or more so RBI can do, is that they should reduce rate of interest for fresh loans significantly, because that is very much in the power of government as well as RBI, and give loans either at 0% or at a very, very insignificant kind of rates, so that people can afford, they can borrow, they can start their businesses which are kind of impacted in a very, very significant manner. So I think that's something which can be done. So this is what I feel. And second thing, most importantly, is that government should start once this pandemic is under control, government should start spending on all kind of things, right from infrastructure to media to all. So see, every industry will have their own demands. So advertising industry has its own demands. All industry bodies have sent their own.
So right now it's a comprehensive package, but there needs to be something sector specific as well, is what you're clearly saying, particularly for, of course, the media and advertising sector.
Alok is also saying that give loans really. 0% or insignificant interest. He's saying spending. Government spending on infrastructure will create its own demand.
I don't think government can satisfy each and every sector. They can work with each and every sector. For the first time in the history, we have seen zero car sales and zero mobile sales in the month of April. So I don't think government can look at each and every industry. I think industry which are directly impacted and impacted for long term, like aviation and F&B and hospitality and all that, I think their government should step in. Rest, I think a measure should be there to create overall demand.
And point taken. Let me take that to Mr. Agarwal. Mr. Dhruv Agarwal, come in here on your initial takeaways of what the government has done so far, what your expectations still are for your sector in specific.
And specifically for the real estate sector, just for our viewers, the lease rental discounting is 1,75,000 crore. That's poor commercial office space. In residential, possibly sales have been very bleak, but with millennials realizing that they need their own roof, they may start buying houses. So what can, in the time when millennials start buying homes and the demand for residential going up, what can the government do to make sure that the real estate and the residential sector stays vibrant?
Look, I think going back to the first question around what I feel the government's done, I think clearly the measures taken by the RBI to add liquidity into the system, I think is a great move, especially in terms of rate cuts and all the interest rate moratoriums. Of course, it will add stress to the financial sector, which does not receive its payments or installments. But at least for the consumer, I think it's a welcome move because the support which demand needs, I think, will come somewhat, from that. In addition to that, of course, being part of the MSME segment, I think what the government's announced in terms of collateral-free loans and guaranteed loans by the government, I think that's again a good move. However, I think the biggest challenge I foresee going forward is demand, because as some of the other panelists have mentioned, that clearly there is a fear of job losses. Job losses have actually happened. Companies have undertaken salary cuts, furloughs, etc. All that is going to directly impact demand for every category, and real estate is no different. I think before I go to residential real estate, what I want to comment on is commercial real estate. As you had mentioned, commercial real estate has been a bright spot as far as the entire sector is concerned. However, now with this lockdown, what we are seeing is that stress is beginning to build up on the commercial real estate sector. Increasingly, tenants are trying to renegotiate rental rates. People have not paid rents for the period of the lockdown. And frankly, with the 70-day lockdown, we are into the 70th day. And who knows at what degrees, will the restrictions ease, especially in the big cities. I think work from home is clearly being seen as an alternative in terms of how the way of working will evolve over a period of time. That, I think, is going to have a significant impact on commercial real estate. As companies already under a lot of financial stress will look to cut costs and working from home and thereby reducing spend on commercial real estate.
I did put this question to a real estate developer who's primarily on commercial, and he said TCS has said 50% will work from home, but the 50% that will come into office will have social distancing norms, making sure that they take the same amount of space as 100%. So the net effect will be balanced out. So you might a logic that it may not have a.
So you may see that offset, Anurag, in the short term, when social distancing norms will be applied in a much more stricter fashion. But just, sort of project 1 year down the line, when hopefully things like a vaccine and stuff are just around the corner, already have been found. At that point in time, I think the work from home will continue to be the norm, because it really significantly improves the cost structure of any business. At that point in time, I think commercial real estate...
work from home is going to be a part of the new normal, is what you're clearly saying. Let me get in Tamanna Dhamija, if I can, at this point. Tamanna is an entrepreneur. How do you react to some of the government announcements so far? And how tough has this pandemic really been for entrepreneurs like yourself? What are you hoping for in terms of incentives in the days ahead as well?
Sure. From a standpoint of MSMEs or startups, right? Like the whole relief package, the way I look at it, it's really broken down into 3 parts, right? One is infusing liquidity, which is really into the banking system, which we've all spoken about. It, the repo rates. The second is really the MSMEs, right? Which is all of the loans and the deferred payouts. Like others have said, the devil is in the details, and how it gets executed is really important. If I compare it to the US, for instance, the money is given to the hands of people, right? It's the middle class, whether you're a founder or you're an employee, the money is directly in the hands of people. So literally every single person got $1,200 in their bank account, right? My entire family is in the US, and now that's, they can still stay home, they can go through things that they will continue to spend on things that are essentials. But here, all of it looks quite promising, but whether it gets executed through the banking channel down to SMEs is extremely important, and we'll only find out how that pans out. I've been talking to a number of founders across, and some sectors have been extremely badly hit, like hospitals, right? What do people with private hospitals even do? They cannot convert them into COVID centers because, then they're deeper sort of into red, right? Because the government expects them to sort of discount the cost of tests and the treatments. So it really, we have to wait and watch and see how it pans out.
You raised some questions regarding the healthcare sector, which we'll get to after the break.
Yeah. So one thing I do wanna.
We're running short of time. We're running short of time. I want to get everyone's opening comments before we take the first break, and then I promise you, after the break, we'll raise some of the larger questions that you've touched upon. Mr. Pandey, come in here with your opening comments. Your of course thumbs up so far to what you heard from the government. What's the big positive for you in the stimulus package, and what still do you expect in the days ahead?
Yeah, thanks for having me here on the show. Basically, what has happened is that this entire package has been targeted towards more on reforms rather than on anything else. So if you see the entire...
Everything else means liquidity.
No, I'm saying reforms, even the liquidity side, if you see, the liquidity is towards whatever LTRO, whatever liquidity has been given, it's more towards the reforms. So all these reforms will pay in the medium term. In the short term, there has to be a direct transfer. And on the direct transfer, if you see out of these 20 lakh crores, about 1.2% is only direct, which is through this Pradhan Mantri Yojana, through their other schemes, they have done about 1.2, which is about 2.6 lakh crores. The rest of the money is all through credit guarantees, through loans, so if you see 10% of their GDP they have given through this stimulus package. Out of that, only 2.6, which is 1.2%, is direct fiscal costs. The rest is through loans and other guarantees, which will take some time. So at the current time, you have to put money in the hands of normal people, corporates, because then only the demand can come. So this entire package is towards supply side. It's not towards demand.
Okay.
So what had happened in 2008, when the crisis happened, Lehman crisis happened, the entire financial system was freezing. Now the entire economy is on ice. So to bring that, you have to do direct transfers like wage subsidy, like Fed has done in US, that you should go out and buy bonds directly. Because that risk aversion, because liquidity is enough in the system. It is about 8 lakh crores is lying in repo in RBI. All banks are not lending. There is a risk aversion. So risk aversion only can go out if RBI can come and directly buy bonds of these companies.
So there are lessons from the West on what we need to adopt as well. Okay, I'll come back to you, Mr. Soin. Let me quickly bring you in here.
Yeah, hi, very good evening.
On particularly the impact on the real estate sector, and I think you also want to speak about the hospitality sector, which has also been very affected by the crisis, and also is pretty disappointed because they've not really seen many announcements for them so far from the government.
Correct. On real estate side, I will differentiate between two buckets. Operating side of real estate, which is hotels, restaurants, malls, and as compared to the development side. I think development side is still relatively okay because the inventory exists. As soon as whenever the demand picks up, the inventory will get sold. There on the development side, the main issue is on the buildable supply side. What has happened, all the labor, Indian development is unfortunately too dependent on labor force. That all has vanished from cities and they're not going to come back anytime soon. And with the kind of statements coming from different state governments that they are going to be extremely protective about labor, without labor, how the developers are going to deliver the product? That even though they want to, they can't. So that's on the development side. On operating side, unfortunately, the things are really pathetic, and I think the worst is not over, and there is nothing in sight, both in terms of demand or in terms of how the business is going to go back, because the whole business models are changing. Nobody is going to go to the hotels. Nobody is going to go to the restaurants in any time near soon. So we need some mechanism to support all the stakeholders in these categories, and these stakeholders include your employees. I run a boutique luxury hotel in Delhi, and I dread to go in that property because the morale of the team is so low. It looks so horrific to see death-like feel on their faces. So that's on your even to the business owners, their needs or the businesses needs to get supported.
Okay. I've got your opening comment. I'll come back to you, as I said, after the break for some of the larger questions. Mr. Abubakar, I need to take a break, but let me come to you last but not the least. For your opening comments, what what you make of what you've heard so far, the positives in the stimulus package by the government, and what really industry needs in the road ahead, and what practically can be done.
I would completely agree with Ashish and Dhruv, who said that yes, the government has definitely done a great job here. They have done a lot more than we could predict or imagine in terms of repo rate cuts, in terms of RBI stepping in, the CRR rates, trying to defer loans to a certain extent. But that's really not enough. There is a lot more areas which I personally feel that needs to be looked into. One and very important part that we've all been talking about is there is supply, there is no demand. I mean, how do you generate demand? What kind of security does a taxpayer have to do? I mean, you are working in your organization, you are paying taxes at whatever bracket you may be, high taxes, low taxes, you've been paying taxes all along. But tomorrow, if you don't have a job, what's in it for you? I mean, you've been raising money, you've been doing $2,000 to the labor class, the mass class, you've been sending money, you've been sending food.
Okay, before we throw it open to the panel, Mr. Abubakar is back with us. Yes, you had some points to make, Mr. Abubakar, before we break.
Yeah, so the point I was trying to make here is that how is the government securing the taxpayers? You are working for large corporates, you are working for large organizations, you have been paying taxes all along. I mean, today, where is demand going to come from? Demand is going to come from these people who actually have the spending power. But if you don't give them the security that your jobs are secured, or in case, God forbid, if you don't have a job, your life will be secured, your basics will be taken care of. They are always going to be holding back the money. They're always going to be keeping the money to themselves, to their heart, and trying to spend less and less. And that's going to impact demand in a big way. But on the other side, if I have some security from the government, that in case if you lose your job also, we are there, we will back you up, we will do this for you, or we will do that for you, whatever. Small or large, doesn't matter. But that community has never been touched upon. It's always the mass that says that, 2,000 rupees is going to the farmers, 5,000 rupees is going here, 300 rupees is going there, which is very good. I am not against or have anything to say on that part. But the other community, which is the real taxpayers, which are the real ones who have the spending capacity, there has never ever anything been done for that segment of people. And I think the government should look upon this segment also. They may be a smaller segment of 3 or 5%, but they are an important part of this economy.
Okay, let's throw it open now. Dr. Batra, let's open it up to some larger questions.
I think what I'm hearing from the panelists today is government should spend more. There should be specific interventions in each sector. Demand is what needs to be created. Sentiment is low. So we will go first to Mr. Bhasin. Mr. Bhasin, you made your opening comment. How does the government get the demand to be back? Maybe the government doesn't want the demand to be back in May, because the government doesn't want everyone to be out buying things, consuming products and services. So tell us, how do we get the demand? Advertising is a big tool to get demand up. That there should be an incentive for advertisers for advertising. Tell us what else can be done by the government.
First of all, the government should want the demand to come back in May. It should want the demand to come back tomorrow morning. It's not about, of course, the process has to be managed because we are heading towards a real financial crisis. States like Delhi, which normally have, let's say, 3,500 crores of revenue in the month of April at 300 crores, likewise in Punjab and so on. So how many more months can we go by if we don't have demand? Because if you don't have demand, there'll be no GST, there'll be no taxes, there'll be nothing, right? So all the good that we're saying, put money in the pockets of people, do this, do that. For that, where's the money going to come from? The only place it's going to come from is if the economy restarts, if the demand restarts. I genuinely believe that advertising has a very important role, more important than what we give it credit for, to play in this. Because we have to incentivize, we have to bring people back, we have to bring the confidence back. That's one. Second thing is, at this moment, the morale of the nation is low. Nobody has the confidence to spend. Even if you have your job, first of all, even if you have your job, chances are your salary would have been cut. But you don't know whether you'll have your job 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 1 year from now. Everybody is going to be in the mood of postponing a purchase, and that's probably not a great thing for an economy to have. So we've got to put in as much liquidity as we can into the hands of people, like Alok said, low interest loans, etc. But the whole focus has to shift that let's revive demand. I don't even think it's on the radar of the government at the moment, because they've got sufficient problems on their hands, and because migrants issue and political everything. First of all, in our country becomes a political issue, even though it might be a basic economic issue in that sense. They just haven't focused in this area. I think the government now needs to shift. So the strategy that you had at the beginning of the crisis has to now change to the strategy of bounce back. All these V-shaped revivals, U-shaped revivals, none of those revivals are going to happen if the demand is not revived. And what are we doing to revive that demand? You have to put more money in the hands of people. Taxes need to be cut. If we don't cut the
taxes need to be cut.
100%, because if you don't cut the taxes, you will not get enough tax revenue. For you to get more tax revenue, you need to cut the taxes, both indirect and direct taxes. I know personally of at least 50 to 100 people who've left India and are going in Singapore, are operating between Singapore and Bombay, simply because at the last budget, the taxes were raised at the personal taxation to a greater level, right? So what is happening? That money which would have come into India, maybe at a slightly lesser rate, is now going to Singapore. And more will flock out because money finds a way to go out on that. GST, which is at a ridiculously high level in some categories, needs to be gotten back, and the focus is how do you increase the volumes so that we get more taxes but at a lower rate. And I think that
balance is required.
Yeah, and but
balance. I want to ask you, when you talk to your large clients, what are they seeing? What are they telling you? When you talk to owners of businesses, CEOs, what is the sentiment you're getting from them?
Look, India is a very sentiment-driven country, particularly for advertising expenses and so on. And the sentiment at the moment is very, very cautious, ultra cautious at this time. All of us, sitting in these panels and all, and many people seem to feel that one fine day lockdown will go up and everything like a switch, everything will start coming back. I was speaking to a very large automobile manufacturer, and I was just telling him, oh, great news, now your factories are going to start, etc. And production will hopefully come back to normal. He told me that for his production to come back to the Jan-Feb level, which in itself was a very low level, as you know, automobiles have been going through a phase, is going to take him a minimum of 4 to 6 months, because labor has gone home. It's not only about him, his whole, raw material and his chain of suppliers needs to come back into action. And most importantly, he said, why will I manufacture the cars unless my dealership starts selling the cars? So again, the demand. If there is no demand, he's not interested in producing. He's not going to produce it and leave it in his warehouses, right? He wants things to roll. So I think most of my clients, or most of the senior people I'm talking to, are in an ultra cautious mood just now. And it is our job as leaders and influencers to shake people out and to shake the government.
That's a pragmatic view. That's quite a pragmatic view you're giving us today, Mr. Bhasin. Tamanna, you had a point which you were raising before we interjected, in the previous half of the show. I think you were trying to touch upon the healthcare sector.
Yeah, no, I was trying to say that, you asked me about how are startups impacted or MSMEs, and I was trying to make a point there that, again, the execution of all of this really matters, and certain sectors are extremely hard hit. This whole initiative of the fund of funds, where a certain money will be pumped as like an equity investment through a fund of fund structure. Again, the details are not yet clear, but it at least seems like they're trying to encourage investments, into startups. And again, it seems positive. But again, the point is, like everyone else here is saying, and, demand needs to come up. And honestly, in the longer term, even supply needs to come back, because if the government continues to pump in money for next 12 months, and then there's a supply shortage because, it'll take time for people to come back up, then God knows what's going to happen to inflation. So it's all kind of linked, and demand is also linked to the sentiment. And the biggest kind of fear in all of this is there's no end date, right? So tomorrow everything could open up, but there is no end date because we still don't know when will there be a vaccine, and that fear is dominating us. So, I feel that in the startup space, like for us in particular, so we look at online communities, we look at, just in India and also overseas, how people are engaging online. And that engagement has gone up massively. Like, in certain cases, we've seen 8 to 10x. People are talking in these closed group communities, talking about the issues that they care about. There's a new normal around health and hygiene, like vaccines in particular. People have just, not just COVID vaccine, but I think just in general, the amount of people that get vaccinations done in India is going to go through the roof. So there's like big changes that are happening, right? And people will spend more on health, more on hygiene.
Dr. Batra?
Yeah.
Good. Tamanna, and you're lucky enough and enterprising enough to raise capital. But I want to go to Dhruv. Dhruv, you're News Corp has invested in you. You're very well funded and doing well. What about the startups that will not be able to raise money in these times? There is a fear that 60% of the startups will run out of cash because their revenues are down and they've not been able to raise capital. Give us a sense of what the government could do to give these startups a lifeline. And, Alokji and Ashish, you're big players. Dentsu Nelson Network is a global company, cash rich. But what about smaller and medium-sized entrepreneurs in the services sector? You're in the marketing advertising sector, but overall in this, how will they survive? So Dhruv, first, what can the government do for startups? And then Alokji and Puneet and Tariq and Vivek on how the government can make sure that the SME entrepreneur stays alive.
One of the things which the government obviously has done, Dr. Batra, is essentially make access to loans a lot easier by making loans collateral free, as well as providing guarantees, etc. So that's one thing. Look, as everybody has said, we've got panelists from across different sectors, and every sector has its own demands. If I were to talk specifically about real estate, there are a plethora of things I could recommend. So I think at some point in time, the government will be stretched in terms of its sheer ability, to help startups. I think because every sector, is in crying need for demand, as we said. The fact of the matter is that demand will take time to come back. There's still a lot of uncertainty, with regard to the virus. As we speak, cases are only going up. So it's still an evolving situation. We don't have a complete grip of what's going to happen. So I think for startups, the biggest thing is one has to plan that demand is going to take 6 to 9 months to come back to what it was before the crisis started. And the only way right now is to ensure that you survive, you make it through this period. So once you're on the other side of the crisis, you actually have a business left, which you can then, grow subsequently. So the first step is to cut all discretionary costs, which is the point even Mr. Bhasin was making, right? I mean, a lot of startups spend money on advertising, cut that down. A lot of startups have already done that. Reduce costs on performance marketing, because what's the point of getting customers in when they don't have money to buy stuff? Look at, all other unnecessary expenditure, reduce those costs. Plus, you have to start looking at your people costs as well, right?
A huge cost.
It's a huge cost. So whether it's in terms of taking voluntary salary cuts across the organization, maybe looking at furloughing people, but at the end of the day, cash is king, and all I can recommend is conserve enough cash so that you can survive for the next 6 to 9 months, because there is going to be no easy recipe for anyone to bring back demand, in the short term. So survival is key, and cash conservation is key.
I think Dr. Batra, you want to join Mr. Jalan at this point as well?
Yes, Alok, I want to ask you. See, you are a large company. You have cash reserves. Ashish is, of course, a global company. What about this? Say an agency that has 20 people, 30 people, 50 people, is 5 crores in turnover. There's a digital agency which has started to blossom in the last 2 years, and suddenly they're faced with this prospective of zero business or 10, 20% business, but the cost are 80 or 100%. What can they do? As an entrepreneur, what is the advice you have for them?
So, see, that's where I think this government's MSME package comes into the play. But I don't think it is a well thought out package, because nobody will take more loan to just pay salaries. I think loan has to be taken for more productive purposes and to kind of restart their businesses and things like that. When it comes to smaller companies and startups, that's where I think government needs to come in and step in, and they need to kind of come up with some kind of loan for all these companies who are startups. So maybe a startup loan kind of a thing, where on the business idea or on the past track record of the startup, some money is given, and that too at a very low interest or zero interest. I think that is the only thing which can help startups and smaller companies.
Punitji, should the government worry about credit rating? You talked about how while the government is talking of 10 lakh crores, you feel that the direct money is less than 3 lakh crores. Now, what else if you saw the package as installment 1, stage 1, package 1, what about package 2 install? What could the government do and build on what it has announced? Of course, front loading of whatever is said has to be done. Execution, Tamanna said the God is in detail. But what else the government can do? Puneet.
So I think the first and foremost thing is that they should not be bothered about the rating as such, neither for the country and neither for the companies which are borrowing, because these are unprecedented times and you need unprecedented measures. Because earlier also, if you see all these recession which happened in India in 58, 66 or 80, it was all driven by monsoon. There is nothing we have seen such kind of a crisis. So you don't have to look at ratings. You have to survive first. Mr. Dhruv was also telling about that you should survive first. So I think the government should relax on the credit ratings, should not get bothered on their country rating also. Because even if tomorrow S&P wants to downgrade India, there's no problem. Even US was downgraded in 2011 from AAA to AA+. And still a lot of capital flowed into US because they actually survived. The demand was created in US in 2011 after the crisis. So here also the money will
relatively we're still very good. Relatively we are much better than everywhere else. So that solidity
because we have
that exists will pull in the capital.
Yeah. So we have to generate that. So rating is not an issue. But I think the other part is that whatever policies we have given, like even this AATMANIRBHAR, the entire piece is towards moratorium loans and all. So you have to supplement or complement it with direct transfers like wage subsidy. If you make a working capital requirement for 2 months, if you give to somebody, that firm will survive, the layoffs will get arrested, and you will pass this period. And if you see all this MSME, the entire package to MSME, 99% of those MSME, there are about 633 lakh MSMEs. Out of that, 630 lakhs are micro SME, which don't have a formal access to cash. So you have to give a cash support, direct cash support to these micro companies.
Thank you, Puneet, for being so specific about it. Vivek, you heard everybody.
I think Ashish Bhasin wants to come in quickly.
Yes. So Vivek,
before Mr. Bhasin has a quick point. Yeah.
Let me give you an example of what's happening in other countries, building on what Mr. Pandey said. Australia has announced a job policy for the next 6 months. Depending upon if you don't sack your people, you don't cut their salaries for the next 6 months or so, the government is going to give you money for that. Singapore has announced 70 for the month of April and May. For every Singaporean in the company, you get 75% of up to a certain limit, and that's quite a liberal limit. You get 70% of the salary as a subsidy, and thereafter 25%. And likewise, every country in the world,
Germany, all have done that.
Almost every country in the world has given.
Ashish, is it fair to compare Indian situation? We are a unique country. We have unique situation. Why should we compare ourselves with Singapore or Canada or UK?
No, we can't and we don't, but we can learn from there, right? Because the biggest problem that's going to hit us, because there is going to be no demand, is actually going to be joblessness. And joblessness can lead to anarchy in the society. The whole social structure is at stake. If I am a educated, unemployed, and my whole family's existence is at stake, I'm going to be desperate. I mean, we saw what was happening with the migrant. That's now going to start happening with the lower middle class and middle class, who actually have been the backbone of stability in our country. So yes, we can't afford to do it, and Singapore and Australia and Germany and all have a lot of money and they can do it, but you can't at the same time ignore this, because if you ignore this, the costs that you will pay for this will be much, much higher. So I think this is now the time to focus on how do we keep jobs going? how do we get demand going? And whatever we need to do, like Mr. Pandey said, it's a survival issue just now. Whatever we need to get this done and to change the sentiment in the next 30 days. I am telling you, if this lockdown continues for 30 days in the way it is now, let's say for the month of June, this country is going to stare down problems which are much more than economic alone. And the economy
come in that every day we lose $5 billion every day in India in a single day. So in 21 days, you have lost already $100 billion in India.
Okay, before we start getting our closing comments, Anurag, you wanted to go to Vivek.
This is actually a human tragedy issue. I agree with Ashish that this is more of a human tragedy, and the humans needs to be addressed in all scenario and across all economic classes. If you don't do it, it's going to be disaster. And for businesses, I'm surprised that businesses who want to fold up, it should be facilitated. Whereas in new announcements, the bankruptcies has become, they are holding back bankruptcy for more than a year, which is silly actually. If I, as a business, I'm not making money, I should have ability to close down and shut down and cut my losses.
Okay, Vivek. Tariq, services sector is 66% of the GDP, and you represent that booming services sector. What can the government do to revive or at least make sure that the services economy survives?
Yeah, again, linking back to the job security, that is the most important factor for any sector to survive. That is the way you can also create demand by giving them the enough ability to spend. How is one going to get ability to spend is by getting job security. There is one more very important sector which has not been looked upon at all. Is most of your, or large sum, I would say, not most, but a large sum of your population today are the small shopkeepers.
Sure.
Okay, so they are not the total low-end people who are getting the 2,000 or the 3,000 benefit. They are not the salaried or the high-end employees. But then they are the large population who do not know where to go. They do not fit into the bracket that they can ask. So they are not the asking category bracket, but then they are not serviced also. I mean, there have been houses which have not been run today because these shops have been shut for days together, months together now, and we don't know for how long will this impact be. They may not be the essential shops which are allowed to open for a couple of hours. But then these are a large population of yours fits in that bracket. I mean, that is where your Indian strength is. Made in India is what you talk about. I mean, these guys are the ones who are supporting the country at the lower end. And again, this bracket of people do not fit in the borrowing category. These bracket of people do not fit in the asking category. Who's taking care of them? And what's in it for them in this whole discussion or in this whole package that the government has released?
No, that's a valid point. That's a valid point, and that's a valid concern. Okay, we're completely out of time now. Let's quickly get some closing comments. Dr. Batra, rapid fire. Let's begin.
Yes, we'll start with Tamanna. Tamanna, what are the 2 or 3 things that can be done by the government and all the stakeholders to get the economy back?
In just a line.
Here I say that Indian entrepreneurs are creative enough to find ways to survive. And I must also say on this NewsX Businessworld broadcast that the government is front-loading whatever it said. In the last 1 week, entrepreneurs and businesses have started to get tax refunds. Now, you may say that's the entrepreneurs' money, but the fact is, it has come into their banks this week. So the government is serious about execution. So what can the government do or the other stakeholders do? 1, 2, 3 points, Tamanna?
Sure. So I think one is definitely working capital loans at very, very low interest rates. Because
what is a very low interest rate?
0 if possible, or extremely low, right? Because it will help them extend their runway. Next, I would say if this 10,000 crore, I know it's a small amount, but if that whole investment pans out well through the fund of funds, that can be massively leveraged up.
Okay, fund of funds, that's a great idea. Let's move on.
0% loans. Puneet Pandey.
Yeah, first I think we should remove the risk aversion because of people are holding cash. So we should remove the risk aversion. We should
change the sentiment. Change the sentiment.
And print currency within limits, even if the fiscal deficit goes high.
Spend your way, print currency, spend your way to an economic recovery. Vivek Soin.
Waive property taxes, waive license fees, and
waive property taxes. Bring down the stamp duty.
Yes. And make bankruptcy laws more easy so that the business who are not making money have ability to close down.
Fantastic, Vivek. Tariq Abu Bakar, your final comments?
While I totally would like to emphasize that the government is doing a great job, but if they can still look at something benefiting the taxpayers, I think that's a very important sector which is supporting
so something
the
for the
economy.
taxpayer. Let's move on. Dhruv.
I would say that the government needs to extend the benefits they've given on affordable housing to houses up to like 60 lakhs to 65 lakhs. That will go a long way in increasing demand for housing.
Yeah, interestingly, people now will want to own their own house or at least have their own space. Yes. Okay. Alok Jala.
So 3-4 quick things. I think cash transfer to poorest of poor people, 0% kind of loan to MSMEs, then some kind of incentive for larger companies so that they don't sack people. So if they keep people, if they don't sack people, then they get some kind of incentive, not any cash transfer or cash support, but some kind of tax cut or something like that. And lastly, government spending.
Okay. Mr. Basir.
Ashish, you have the last laugh, literally. We started with you, we end with you.
First of all, I would say you've got to change the mood of the nation, which is now getting a bit despondent. Second thing is open up. Whatever now has to happen has happened, but open up and unshackle the businesses. Third thing is cut the taxes, at least in the short run in that. And fourth thing is stimulate demand in every way you can. And a great way to do that is through advertising, incentivize advertising.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So that pretty much sums up today's show, Dr. Batra. And
Ashish, what you said has been echoed by many panelists, is have an exit strategy fast and exit fast so that the economy can start coming back to normal.
Absolutely. That wraps up today's show. Hope our viewers enjoyed watching. Thanks so much to our panel for joining us. Let's hope more of these conversations take place as we, of course, enable and aid our economy to get out of this pandemic and the unprecedented situation to hopefully much better days ahead. For now, a very quick break. Thanks once again to our panelists and Dr. Batra for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.